Well, good morning, everyone. I want to welcome everybody to our session, Understanding the Ethos of Your Community to Determine Strategic Priorities and Direction. And it's the anatomy of crowdsourcing within our partnership with the school district Middletown and their superintendent, Dr. Michael Connor. I'm happy to be with you all this morning. My name is Evan St. Leifer. I am Senior Advisor and Strategic Partner of Innovate K-12, and thrilled to be moderating what will be a really cool dialogue with Kristen and Dr. Connor. So what I'd like to do is just a little bit of a brief intro, and then we're going to dive right into this conversation. So Kristen, I'm going to hand the baton to you, my partner, and we'll go from there.
Great. Thanks, Evan. I'm excited to be here and very excited to be talking with Dr. Connor and continuing to learn from him, as we all do. So my name is Kristen Daniels. I'm a licensed educator and co-founder of Innovate K-12, and our primary goal is to bring crowdsourcing to schools, districts, and school communities and education communities. So Dr. Connor's been working with us, and we're here to highlight his work and looking forward to those stories.
Awesome. Dr. Connor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, no, this has just been a very interesting time, right? And what I mean by intriguing is that the pandemic has created new conditions for all of us as educators, whether it be at the executive level, even changing the paradigm of instruction in the classroom level. But I think that this pandemic has gave us permission to innovate, to be creative, to test idiosyncrasies that we haven't been able to test before in a quote unquote standardized industrial paradigm age, i.e. pre-COVID. And and I think that now, as we look to move to or out of the pandemic, post-pandemic, I like to call it AD, after disease, we have to be able to look at new creative ways to be agile in education and apply this association process of learning from outside industries like corporate America, R&D work, design thinking principles to be able to now integrate those strategies in a context-dependent manner in education. So this has just been a warm welcome to, innovators, the incubator of innovators in education, and to really have that serial disruption, this disruption that is kind of like the context of now grounding innovation and really creating those flexible functions. So this has been an interesting time, obviously trying to navigate through the pandemic, but also an opportunity to learn and scale intentionally.
Well, that's perfect. That's a great segue into the framing for this, which, as you said, Dr. Connor, is really about how crowdsourcing and the ability to use this innovative practice to really mine the collective intelligence and collective wisdom of your school community is now a must-have, because schools need to operationalize in more innovative ways. They need to be more effective. So we were thrilled to be able to work with you on a use case. For everyone listening in, we're going to talk a lot about strategic planning with Dr. Connor and the way he's approached it. And so in essence, what I'd love to do is just take a moment to frame what crowdsourcing is for our folks, because that's something we come across a lot. A lot of people have heard of crowdfunding, but it's so critical now that schools, solution providers, educational organizations adopt this practice to be able to help them, again, not only learn and understand, we say the ethos of your crowd, to understand what they're thinking, what their concerns are, what's keeping them up at night, but also I think the true opportunity, and Dr. Connor will talk a lot with you about this, is how do you then leverage and engage to come up with really second order types of solutions that you may not have thought of before. So Kristen, why don't we just take a quick walk through the slide deck, and we're just going to briefly review crowdsourcing to give everyone a better working knowledge. And essentially, we can do this. It can be used with all types of organizations, both internally and externally for their stakeholders. But we're working now with schools, school districts, school communities, which of course is part of the school fabric and that ecosystem, education cohorts and agencies, as well as professional learning networks. And so it's the opportunity to collaborate, as we said, and then bubble up the best of that work in the data. And so who's it good for? Well, as Dr. Connor will tell you, with Kristen, we were able to deploy crowdsourcing in Middletown with a number of different stakeholders, from faculty to students to parents and families. We believe community members are important, and especially for this community, we believe there's a deep opportunity for solution providers to be excellent partners and really help them be in better sync, in close sync with their school communities. And so solution providers, we believe, have a great opportunity to use this technology as well. And then this is really the most important thing, like what is it? What's the most important part of what you can maximize crowdsourcing for? And really the most important thing, as I said earlier, is it allows you to deeply understand and build trust with your stakeholders. And think about how important this is. You know, Dr. Connor, we're here at ERDI in Florida. We have virtual people listening in, and school leaders are talking about how critical it is always to build trust, especially if you're a new school leader. How do you gain that trust and sense of camaraderie and working relationship with a new community? And this is where it gets exciting, is when we talk about leveraging collective intelligence to solve problems that don't necessarily have easy answers, and being able to understand that you can go across the community broadly, different stakeholders, or you can focus on specific stakeholders. You can mine really very dynamic ideas, which you'll hear about in just a moment.
Can I just add something? In our
course.
recent conversation with Dr. Connor, Dr. Connor, you said something that really, really stuck with me, because it's obvious through the work that we've already done together that this was really meaningful for you. So when you take a look at that, you know, more deeply understanding your stakeholders, one of the things you said was, you know, not only do you get their primary needs, but you get their secondary and their latent needs. And I thought that was just really remarkable. And it's something that, you know, is so valuable in crowdsourcing, because we've said now that sometimes in the data, there are answers to questions you haven't asked yet. And I think the more that we do this, and the more that we're working with school districts, and especially strategic planning, we're finding that to be very true. So I know that we're going to probably get into some of those details, but I just wanted to point that out. Yeah.
That's great. And then I think it's the last slide, Kristen, we have here, which is really around the process, which we're going to talk more about. I think this is a very intriguing visual, because Kristen and I know Dr. Connor, you sort of fancied this term now as well. We talk a lot about creative abrasion. And if you think about that term, and yes, you have to pay me every time you use that. No, I'm just joking. But the idea of bringing together divergent ways of thinking, different points of view and perspectives, and how often those types of differing views are embedded in any sort of crowd or any sort of stakeholder group. And then the idea of being able to bring those and elevate those ideas to the top based on a process that uses artificial intelligence, so that it converges in a way that leads to higher level prioritized topics and ideas. So that's the mechanics of the crowdsourcing work. Kristen, did you want to add anything to that before I give the baton to Dr. Khan? I have a specific ask of him, but did you want to mention anything?
I do want to say one thing. A lot of people ask us about the difference between surveys and crowdsourcing, and while we're not going to dive deep into that right now, one of the pieces that I'll comment on with the divergent thought and the thinking and the different ideas is that in crowdsourcing, it's all transparent. So you're seeing what other people are putting in and saying, and that really, really impacts the results that come out of a process like this. So transparency is really a key component of this.
So Evan and Chris, can I jump in really fast, because I mean that divergent thinking, when I think about that, right, and I know that we're going to get in it later in the presentation, is that crowdsourcing usually CEOs and organizational leaders use an outward in approach, right?
Right.
They use this the design of the systems and the mechanisms and the architecture is forced to change the culture of the organization. But divergent thinking and convergent work leads to inward outward, where now when you have the crowd involved in the process, there's that collective capacity, collective mindset, and that innovation where now it becomes more outward, where now the organization architectures and structures are automatically being changed because it's more outward. I mean, it's more inward outward. So when we
Yeah,
think about there's that parallelization between divergent thinking and inward outward approach to designing your organization.
That's such a great
absolutely.
insight. And Dr. Connor, I'm gonna just to pick up on that. It would be great for you to further contextualize your experiences. You know, what does crowdsourcing mean to you and Middletown in the process in which you engaged as a roll up to strategic planning? But I would love for you to also take it from this really wonderful undergirding work and research that you did at Harvard with Kareem Lakhani. And at some point we can give you know a link to his book. Kareem Lakhani is the founder and co-director for the Lab for Innovation Science at Harvard. And Kristen and I just appreciate in our work with you referencing some of that work into your philosophy around the way you've worked with us in crowdsourcing with the district.
Yeah, absolutely. So I give Kareem all the credit, right? And I completed the Harvard Business Analytics program. And that was a program where you take 6 courses, 2 seminars, and there was 2 immersions. And the first course that I took within the business analytics program was called Innovation and Strategy. And towards the end of the course, Kareem obviously was just so much of great content to really be disruptive, specifically disruptive within an organization and new ways to bring in innovation within an organization. And one that really captured me that I never saw in education underscored or even discussed was the use of the crowdsourcing approach. And within one of the courses, or at the end of the course, there was a statement he said that resonated with me that I knew that I can have new value capture and value creation, specifically from the language from the course, within Middletown Public Schools. Moreover, something that we can be able to experiment in education, and that was the wisdom from the crowd. The crowd has the wisdom, and that stuck with me. So when I started learning about crowdsourcing through this course that Kareem was teaching, it really resonated where that now the crowd can be used to answer some of the vexing research questions or some of the persistent problems that we see in education, right? Usually we're very didactic, we're research grounded, applied research in this mechanistic way. And then obviously sometimes it doesn't work. But what is obsolete are our practitioners, are our students, and are our customers, our most important customers, i.e. parents and students that we service. So using this platform with Kristen, partnering with Innovate K-12 to bring in crowdsourcing to be the linchpin for our strategic planning process. Now the voice of the crowd is represented, and then the problems, primary, secondary, and latent needs or critical issues that we need to address in Middletown, this is coming straight from them. Then we can be able to apply the research strategically in a plan and in a process that identifies priority implementation steps, milestones, goals, and theory of action, that whole cycle of continuous improvement. So again, this was just an idea, a concept that I learned in one of my courses in the Harvard Business Analytics program, and then applied it strategically with Kristen. And right now we're about to start the process of developing our next strategic operating plan based off of the information from the crowd.
Well,
I just have to do a
yeah.
pause real quick, because every time we talk to Dr. Connor, we always glean these little tidbits. And I saw Evan like move to write down.
Oh, I wrote it.
Dr. Connor, you did. So what is it? Content, or was it creative creation and capture?
Value
Cloud Hustle
capture,
was
value creation.
Value
This
capture,
is all
value
from,
creation. I
this is
love it.
all from my, this is all from the business analytics program. I tell you, I don't know if this is an implicit, advertisement for that program, but it's so, it changed my whole thinking about education. It changed my whole thinking processes on how we can be adaptive and have this level of association and learn from corporate America, learn from the research and development world, learn from entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship, and then apply it strategically in education and being context aware of how we're applying it in a strategic context.
Yeah,
So that's awesome.
great.
So just to stay linear here, let's just dive right in. And Kristen and Dr. Connor, you guys just dive in, because what you just left off with was answering the vexing questions. So why don't we start talking about some of the high priority and vexing questions and issues that you believe have been addressed in a really compelling way that is now helping you shape, again, the way you're thinking about strategic planning. And Dr. Connor and Kristen, you're both finding things together, so by all means.
Well, go ahead, Dr. Connor.
Yeah.
I think just a brief introduction of how you started with the process, and I'm always so fascinated with looking at the data coming in from the crowdsourcing events that you've done, and then also seeing your perspective on everything. So please go ahead.
Yeah. So immediately, I believe after I completed that first course, with Kareem and Marco Estetti, who is also the co-author of Kareem's newest book. I contacted Kristen, and I don't know if you remember, Kristen, when I contacted you, and I said, "Hey, let's try this out." And Kristen was like, "Okay." It was a complete outlier of anything that traditional education institutions or the industry in itself has done. And I just brought this very abstract idea of this is the last year of our current strategic operating plan. And as we started to move into this pandemic hit, and innovators are saying, okay, this is an opportunity to really be disruptive and take a look at how are we going to look at education fundamentally different? How are we going to change the status quo and challenge the status quo? And the only way to really understand that is by underscoring a crowdsourcing approach where the wisdom is coming from the crowd, where we would ask specific questions, and then STEM questions will come, or variations from that. And then here you are, a bunch of abundant ideas to be able to strategically plan around and frame and identify the next steps for the experts to implement. And I explained to Kristen, I told Kristen that I wanted to use this information to guide us, to be able to guide us to look at the research and then apply this in a way where there's the agile and pull method, where we can be strategic, have strategic adaptation based off of this growth disruptive process. And once we started collecting the ideas, right, and some of these ideas are persistent to what's going on in the pandemic, really elevating and leveraging mental health and social emotional supports for our schools, developing more career clusters or occupational focused curriculums for students to ensure that they're career ready. Changing the monolithic approach in our classrooms to where there's facilitation, where it's grounded on critical thinking and problem solving and coordination of students within their thoughts. This new business model that we talk about in education. And then also too, which is more prevalent, is for us to be more progressive and provocative in our practices, eliminating the standard grading system of A through F for equity purposes, eliminating age graded classrooms, so that now we're focused more on the student in a personalized manner, and then bringing in artificial intelligence, these digital platforms within the tier one model, or the multi-tier system of support, where it's evident in tier one, tier two, and tier three, where we can get to the exact zone of proximal development of students. Again, having this level of applied creativity and using that in this imaginative way within our implementation. So we had 1,102 participants that roughly generated about over 400 ideas and roughly about 1,100 likes. And when I took those ideas and those likes, I framed it in a research context where now it developed the strategies and the actual performance measures and goals for the next strategic operating plan that we're developing. And then that's when we have the goal bucket groups, the strategic planning workshops, to be able to cogitate over these specific strategies, make strategic refinement, because the teams that we're developing for the strategic planners, they're interdisciplinary by design, meaning that you have multiple levels of dynamic expertise that are addressing that problem. So it's not just a linear approach to solve the problem. And using that, right? And I think one of the things that Kristen and I talked about was that we had to move, it was a mental model shift, right? From surveys to crowdsourcing, static approaches that's usually underscored in education versus now these innovative approaches that we're applying in education and making that shift where it's not just a static survey where it's binary in context, but we're elevating the sophistication within our design so we can get to those secondary and latent questions or those facts and research questions so we can challenge the research and an experimental mindset.
Yeah, so I just wanted to jump in and...
I know I was talking long, but I can
No,
talk
it's perfect.
I apologize.
Great. But you just said something that's not a small detail, the difference between, doing surveys and using the crowdsourcing tool and technology and platform. So it would be great to articulate the difference in the quality and the type of data you're getting that has facilitated the strategic planning, as if you were talking to a colleague, superintendent, or even a thought partner who's a solution provider, because that's the thing that Kristen and I are constantly talking with and socializing around with other, again, prospective partners, is that difference between the survey and the crowdsourcing and the data that you get from that. And Kristen, also feel free to jump in.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because I think any CEO or superintendent want to go on an exploration process to be problem centric, right? Design thinkers always seek problems to explore, create, implement, and test. And it doesn't give you an answer. It gives you more questions for exploration and for experimentation. I think that educators now are forced to be edgy on problems, which is perfectly fine. To be hopelessly analytic in this world is absolutely fine too. And that's what the crowdsourcing process does for you. And one thing that I found myself, as well as my team, and also Kristen being a strategic thought partner, is elevating the sophistication around the questions that the data has presented. Static surveys can't give you that. It's basically yes or no. This is how people are feeling. This is how people, this is what people want. But when you go deeper into the crowdsourcing, you're starting to unwrap and disaggregate those specific data points. And you're actually you're hearing the voice of your crowd. You're hearing the voice of the constituency and the stakeholders that you serve. So I think that if people are looking for an answer, you're not going to find it in crowdsourcing, but you're going to find more questions for deeper exploration to improve your organization.
That's fantastic. Kristen, I'm going to ask you, I know you want to say something, but if you could, I want to ask two things of you. First of all, if you could just explain a little bit about what Dr. Connor just characterized around how we end up elevating, to use his terms, and the way we disaggregate the data and get deeper data, how that actually happens so people get an idea. And then after that, I would love to then dive into some of the mechanics of our relationship, like some of the things that you did and how we got started with Middletown. So that's a good question. I would love for you to answer that one first.
How we got started?
No, just about the process of how the ideas bubble up.
So I think what Dr. Connor said about the importance of the question. So one of the things we do is we spend a lot of time prior to the launch of an initiative or an event, talking about what the end goal is and determining who's going to be a part of that. And we spend a lot of time on how what the question is, the actual words that we use to ask the questions, because every single word matters. And so from that, what you get are, if you're looking for ideas or feedback, you get that. But also, because it's a very transparent platform, people are building off of other people's ideas and they're commenting. So they're providing extensive context to what's behind the primary idea or the primary post. So I think that's where it gets to be very, very rich, is that it's not, we talk about surveys being sort of one way and static and isolated. In the context of crowdsourcing, we're having this interaction of your stakeholders sharing ideas and discussing them and talking about them. So it is a very, very rich thing. It does not necessarily make the data cut and dry. Like Dr. Connor said, you don't necessarily get an answer like, here's your end answer. As we sat down and looked at the data together, it was beautiful to see. And I would love for you to talk about this, Dr. Connor, the emerging themes. I think part of what I loved about watching from my perspective, your process with this in Middletown's questions, is that you validated things you were already doing as well. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how not only is that a critical part of, your leadership, but also then, finding those new themes or new, areas to then ask more questions and explore.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because you know why? It's kind of what the statement that I said at the outset, right? Permission to innovate, permission to be creative. Because when I come up with these radical progressive design elements and really looking at the innovation tenets in the context of, testing the failure modes of traditional education structures, people be like, you're crazy. I'm like, no, you told me to do that. That was in the data. So I always put it back on them. But yeah, no, it did validate some of the creative opportunities that we've had in Middletown. And it also gave us permission to exercise this, what I like to call innovation capital, right? Generate new ideas for high impact and high leverage. And it validated, some of the things that we're doing. We built an aerospace manufacturing program that will lead to certificates, as well as dual enrollment in college and possibly an associate's degree and high school diploma at the same time. Our innovation lab that we're designing, that is going to be career focused, that is going to be a hub. Again, kind of goes back to my experience in the Harvard Business Analytics program, developing a hub in our new middle school that will be able to have students explore with the multiple pathways, career pathways of their choice. Artificial intelligence integration, to be aligned with Generation Alpha, Generation Z. But I think, but more importantly, and this was where Kristen, she was actually in this meeting, in this team meeting, when we start unwrapping the data, is how can we be more focused and copious with dealing with social emotional learning, mental health, and racial equity. And this is coming from our students, right? Not even the students. So now we have to, and we started asking more questions, which has now elevated us to, when we move into the strategic planning process, we'll be able to look at building systems that are aligned vertically, that supports SEL, mental health, and really underpinning racial equity.
Can I, in one of our follow-up conversations as we were reviewing some of that data, one of the questions I asked you was, what was surprising, or what did you find surprising? Would you mind sharing, again, because you don't necessarily just get answers to the questions you're asking, but you get answers to other things you're not asking. So can you tell us or share anything about what you discovered that you didn't know from this process?
Yeah, students acting as pseudo psychologists and counselors.
Supporting one another.
I didn't realize the magnitude of how much students were supporting each other in this environment. And, when I look at that, where students are relying on students more than ever in this, I started going deeper and exploring with this and talking more to our students about what does this look like and what can we as the adults change our practices. around supporting them even more. And we've gotten some really, really great ideas that we're actually going to bring into the strategic planning process. But I would have never known that if student voice wasn't embedded in the crowdsourcing campaign and our strategy here to include student voice.
That peer-to-peer network, opportunity is just so profoundly
and Evan,
exciting,
and can I just interject really fast, Evan?
Yep.
Elementary students. That's all I wanted to say. It wasn't just high school students.
Right.
Elementary students were saying this as well.
That's fantastic.
6th, 7th graders.
So I want to take a step back because, again, I think it's important for people to know the rules of engagement. How do we engage? How do we engage together as partners? So, Kristen, I think, as you said, there's you sort of alluded to a very highly consultative process early on to confirm objectives and then to build the right questioning regime, if you will, around the objectives. And then that's iterative. But any other moving parts or pieces that you want to share in terms of how we were able to build this successful partnership and work with Middletown would be great, with Dr. Connor, of course, chiming in.
Great. It'll be brief. I think primarily just working with a district who's new to crowdsourcing. I mean, that the community is, Dr. Connors, we're learning from you too. Just wanted to clear that up. But
I'm geeking out with you and Evan.
I know, I love it, right? So part of it is that, and Dr. Connor, you've already alluded to this, which is crowdsourcing is really new to the community and it's very different than surveying. So being very deliberate and intentional and upfront about communicating with your stakeholders, whoever that target group may be, what you're looking for and the end goal, like what your goals are. In this case, it was very much framed as the strategic, the launch of the next strategic planning process. So I think part of that is, the communication. And then Dr. Connor has an amazing team, and we would come together, and he has, diverse positions and perspectives coming in to be a part of that team so that everyone's informed, that they could speak to the process and are well aware of how it's going to move. And that's also a huge part of what we want districts to be doing, is like getting people on board so they can support the process. And so that was really those two things, the buy-in and the communication for the stakeholders. So, and that's always ongoing. So one thing we do is we always sort of check in as the initiative or the event is going on, and we say, hey, how's it going? Are we getting people checking into the site? And we sort of modify and adjust based on the goals of Middletown in this case. It's a wonderful, fun process. I love it.
Any details?
Can you guys take a question?
Oh, I think, yes, sir. Sure, Joey.
Yeah, so Dr. Connor, thank you so much. I really appreciate you all recording this so that the RDI community can have a chance to listen to it. So what about navigating conflict or mitigating conflict or solving conflict? Useful, do you think, from the practitioner's standpoint, or not necessarily appropriate?
Are you talking about in the context of the online space or in the questions you're asking?
Well, both. Is it it's a great tool to use, and it's just a matter of getting their questions strategically there? Or Dr. Connor, what do you think about that? Or is that really only real time, not tech enabled sort of conversation?
I hope I'm answering your question, Joe, when I give you this answer. So when I think of mitigating conflict, I think of a process of sense making where the collective mental models understands what this process is about. And the questions that Kristen and I constructed was purely from the baseline data that the Strategic Operating Plan Middletown 2021, and I'm not just talking about baseline data in the context of just purely quantitative metrics, but also the qualitative information, i.e. the implementation steps, or milestones that we've completed, some of the new innovation designs. And what we wanted to do was to continue to scale this to be creative. So that's where the questions had came from. So it wasn't an outlier to our community because they know that this was just kind of, we have an understanding of the 3-year strategic plan that we've already implemented and what would be that next step to elevate the work. So I think what we had to mitigate was this wasn't a survey, because Kristen and I kept on going back to our constituency and saying, no, the reason why you're having some issues with this is because it's not just purely static in design. This is more to be iterative and fluid to build on ideas from the crowd. So I think we had to do a kind of like a shift so that people understood what this was about.
I think I understand your question, Joey, and I think the way that we work and frame the process is always very positive. It's always coming from a very positive perspective, and the crafting of the question really is critical, that it drives positive, innovative, creative, thoughtful thinking. And so I don't necessarily think, behind every conflict is a problem. So obviously, when we try and say, you can tackle problems with crowdsourcing, you can, but you really sort of flip it and frame it as, hey, here's an opportunity. And you say, how might we, and then you frame it as like, where are the positive, like, where are we going in a positive direction? So I think, again, behind every conflict is problem, and there's opportunity to get input from the crowd on that.
Yep. So as an example, we're at RDI right now. We're running 25% in person, 75% virtual, but we're consumed with every single superintendent has got the issue of coming back to school, how to come back to school, when to come back to school, meaning the buildings, and no one or few people are happy. Everyone's got their opinion. Politically, we got divided over it, and superintendents are just left with this hot potato. And does this have merit in something like that? Or it just completely not appropriate, and only go after proactive things like crowdsourcing, ideation, to fuel strategic planning, et cetera, et cetera.
So yes, can I jump in on this, Evan?
Of course.
So I think, to answer the question, absolutely. But then it really depends on who your participants are, who your crowd is. And we're actually working with a group of professionals, secondary school principals in Minnesota, and they're tackling this very question. So what they've done is they've identified this topic as relevant, timely, pertinent right now, and they're turning it around on this crowdsourcing platform. And they're not necessarily trying to come up with one solution, but they are sharing ideas, best practices, and they are sort of crowdsourcing the best of their professional learning network into one spot. So absolutely, I think to that point, it can be used in this context. I don't know if I would turn it out to a community and say, what should we be doing? To answer your question. But when you bring superintendents together to share and become a hub for best practices, I think that's absolutely a perfect way to do it.
Dr. Connor, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, Kristen, ditto, right? To simplify it, I think that now this is the time to be able to explore those best practices, create conditions for co-creation and aligned leadership where stakeholders and constituents feel like they're involved within the design process, i.e. their voice is being undergirded within the strategic plan that we're going to be developing. And I think that now this is a time to eliminate the idea of adopting reform ideas de jour as is, but to constantly test these conditions, test what the research is saying, and being able to be agile and iterative, and looking at now education as this macro prototype that continuously is going to be evolved and scaled intentionally. So I really like that now we can come together, test best practices, and have that permission to do it. Pre-COVID, people would look at us, the traditionalists, I will always say, would say, why are you doing this? My students aren't, part of a lab, and experimentation was what was bad in the education sense. Now the pandemic has created these conditions where it's imperfect, it's inconsistent, and now this is the time to test new conditions. This is the perfect opportunity to re-engineer the industry.
Right.
I've never seen a time that's better than right now, and this is the opportunity to be able that we as educators have to take it.
I'd just like to highlight
Awesome.
what
You.
Dr. Connor is saying in that, we're talking about strategic planning in the context of Middletown, where Dr. Connor is the superintendent, but he's also talking about then taking that information and testing innovative ideas. And it's great. I think that's, it's sort of like a 2-in-1. You're taking input from the crowd, you are understanding their needs, and you might be testing new ideas or new things before contributing a bunch of resources to an idea that is not desired by your community, or is it feasible?
I would just add to that there are some polarizing thoughts and concerns and fears, right, in terms of going in school, not in school, etc. But I think this work also has a chance to, at its very essence, to do something really important, which is understanding what is the fear behind someone's position. I know we've done campaigns where someone had a thought, a parent about not going back to school, and yet they didn't understand that there was actually their fears were allayed because they had some information that wasn't correct. So do the constituents have all the right information that they're basing that knowledge on? So I think there's a great opportunity for understanding. And then I also just want to pivot, Dr. Connor, into some of the language that you're using, which I think is just from a best practice standpoint. We would love to share this, nomenclature with other colleagues, superintendents for sure. But it's interesting because when you mention words like disruption and innovation, sometimes, right, we're all going to get real here, where for some people that might mean, oh, disruption, innovation, I'm not ready for that. Or not yet, or I gotta just deal with this now, I can't worry about that. So I'm curious because again, the belief that you have articulated is that this is work that needs to be formalized in our operationalization is what I'm trying to say, in the work that we do. So how do we go from aspirational, like this is really great stuff, to helping school superintendents and of course solution providers realize this as a best practice, like they have to be doing this work?
Well, to be blatantly honest, Evan, they have to do it now because of the pandemic. I mean, you can't run away from it, right? And disruptive innovation has been around for a while, right? When we talk about Clay Christensen's work, when we talk about the work out of MIT that's around design thinking, and Kareem's work, and I mean, there's a myriad of different innovators that are outside the industry. Now we have to start thinking about looking at innovation where we're adopting creative solutions by borrowing from different industries to address the most persistent problems. We know the incumbent, i.e. the industrial model, the industrial paradigm has not worked for our students. The data is blatant with that. It's sorry that it took a pandemic to bring us here, but we have to be disruptive, we have to be innovative, and we have to be creative now because we're dealing with a pandemic, and post-pandemic, we can't go back to the de facto. We can't go back to the incumbent, and we have to continue to push forward with that. So ambitions and aspirations have to turn into best practices and new practices. As Ray McNulty was saying, this VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous.
Perfect. And so if you had a couple of colleagues, and I'm coming back to this because I think it's important that we give you voice to how you could talk with your other superintendent colleagues from Stanford schools, or a couple of your superintendent colleagues from Connecticut, and they were on with us now. What is the way that you would appeal to them about how critical this work is for them? what's that way to really cement this for them?
I think they understand that, one thing that we saw within the pandemic that is very obvious, and we've been talking about this for years, but I think it was really highlighted during the pandemic, is the exacerbation of some of the inequities that we've seen in education. And to really now curtail these inequities, whether it be from the excellence gap to opportunity access gap, whatever gaps that we want to be able to highlight, there's a myriad of them, that we have to be able to be aggressive and progressive. And what I mean by aggressive is that we have to be aggressive in curtailing these persistent gaps. And then we also have to be progressive by looking at new ideas that haven't been historically tested in education. And now is the perfect time. We have the permission to do it. The pandemic has created those conditions. And now is the time to really memorialize and operationalize these practices within our industry. So pretty much every industry has been disrupted, right? We've moved to Uber Eats now, where food is McDonald's is delivered to our house. We don't have to go through a drive-through no more, right? Where the drive-through was the innovation, now it can be delivered. We don't have to stay at hotels anymore. We don't have to get taxis. We have Uber, we have Lyft. That same type of disruptive innovation has to occur in education.
That's great. And so what do you think? We talked about some of the key findings, which, Kristen and Dr. Connor, we shared around some of that. But all in all, what do you think worked best? So, this endeavor and the fact that you're moving forward with Innovate K-12 as a continuous part of your process now as you move into strategic planning, what were the highlights in terms of what worked best?
I can be crazy. No, let me stop you on that. I know, right? And what I mean by crazy is that the community really wants to test the conditions of education. The community really wants to create equitable environments, and it's okay for us to look at education fundamentally different here in Middletown to be able to create those conditions for our families and our students. And also, I think that it's starting when we talk about divergent thinking. I think that the convergent work is starting to expand just beyond the perimeters of Middletown, where this level of thinking is being elevated to a platform. I mean, look at us now. We're speaking in front of a national crowd in Erdy. Maybe a year ago, crowdsourcing and strategic planning that's working in this interface context might have not have been leveraged, but because of the pandemic, we're starting to think differently and plan differently our organizations. So the opportunities that is creating, but more importantly, people are starting to say, hey, let's look at education and how we educate students differently to provide the highest quality of services for our families.
Can I just jump in? Because again, in conversations we've had before about your more recent crowdsourcing event, you mentioned some benefits that you weren't expecting. And I think it had to do with your relationships with the community and businesses and things that you were already doing. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, relationships are key, right, Kristen? Mm-hmm. And I think that within the data from the crowdsourcing campaign that we conducted here in Middletown, people felt okay to speak, right? It's just kind of like this digital ethnographic approach that we used. I've been out in my community a lot because, again, in order for me to be able to leverage these type of changes or this type of transformation, you have to establish trust and you have to establish relationships. And I think that this was a new digital way because of the pandemic to deepen and strengthen those relationships as well. It was very evident within the data that we collected. That was one of the promising themes that was outlined, and that is that the innovation and the relationships that we've established here in Middletown Public Schools was critical and foundational with that. And I think that the crowdsourcing platform, with Innovate K-12, you as a superintendent or CEO will automatically strengthen your relationship with your constituency because their voice is heard loud and clear, and you can be able to respond to their voice and their responses.
Yeah. You had also mentioned that some of the existing initiatives that you had going on became accelerated because of the awareness that the community had. And I know that you mentioned there was legislators became aware of some things in a positive way that accelerated something you were doing.
Yeah. There's a couple, right? One was our pre-K initiative where we brought an artificial intelligence software and integrated that into the community where every 3 and 4-year-old student had access to this AI solution where it's grounded on the foundational skills of literacy. And we're starting to see more students enter Middletown Public Schools kindergarten ready. Those readiness skills, foundational skills that leverages for students to start reading. And we're starting to see a huge transition with that from an outcome standpoint. But the back end of it is that it was highlighted within the crowdsourcing campaign that, the community outreach and support with that, we want to be able to expand that and start our focus on universalizing pre-K in Middletown, where every 3 and 4 student will have an opportunity for pre-K, whether it be a community pre-K or pre-K that we're building at the school, which the crowdsourcing campaign, because of that, within my next budget presentation or the budget presentation for next year, we're expanding it by, I believe it's 3 classrooms that we're going to do. And
wow, that's great.
Came from the crowdsourcing campaign that closing the preparation gap is essential to closing the achievement gap.
That's great. The transparency becomes a great communication tool as well. That's awesome.
How do you say no to the community, right?
Yeah.
Boy, is that a slogan? That's really, a great thing to be able to say from this work. And what are you hearing? It would be great just to hear personally what people have said to you, different constituents, as a result of being involved and being heard. And just be, whether it's a teacher or a student or a family member, just what kinds of things have you heard? It would be great to share some of that.
They feel that there's more agency within the community and within the education system. They feel that they have a voice within the design process of our organization. And it is not your traditional bureaucracy where it is top down, the hierarchy is top down. Whatever I say, this is what's going to be implemented. It's really that bottom up grassroots approach where we were deliberate, taking an ethnographic approach, hearing the needs from our constituents, from our customers, and they're more apt to be able to provide more feedback on the product that we're developing and how we can continue to iterate the prototype as well. So they feel that they have a voice, and there's certainly a high level of agency within the construct of the organization.
That's terrific.
Great.
Anything you want to add to that, Kristen?
Nope. I know that we're coming up on the end of the hour, and I know that I just want to say one thing, that you have some great resources on your Middletown website that from your strategic planning process and talk about how crowdsourcing is interwoven into the process. So I just want to make sure that people who are viewing this know that if you're interested in crowdsourcing and strategic planning, that Dr. Connor has a number of documents on there that talk about this process.
Yeah, and our first onboarding session is this afternoon, Evan and Kristen. And one of the points that I'm going to highlight within the presentation is exactly from the crowdsourcing campaign. And then we'll start getting into the technical frames of the actual strategic plan. Be on the lookout, Middletown 2024, elevating innovation, equity, and elevating innovation, creativity, and equity.
That's awesome.
Yay.
Well, Kristen, thanks for mentioning those resources, because the more we talk about this, I think it's important for us to include resources like Dr. Connor's report. I know it's a PDF. Dr. Lacani's book from Harvard. That's a really, by the way, Dr. Connor, I've already gotten the book. But I think the more we can build our growing collection of best practice I think would be really, really important for other districts that are moving this direction, as well as solution providers. So, Kristen, any last words before we give Dr. Connor the floor for a last word?
Nope, I just have really enjoyed working with Dr. Connor in Middletown, and I think it's a wonderful, fun process.
We look forward, Dr. Connor, to continuing that with you. It's exciting work, and hopefully being able to use you as an exemplar with some of the other districts because of the amazing work you're doing would be just awesome. So great to have you here today.
Thank you
for this conversation.
Completely honored, Evan, Kristen. This has just been great. And again, I have a bias of talking to you. I learn from both of you each and every time. So I hope that we can continue the Geek Out sessions and continue to grow together, share best practices.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Take care, Evan. Bye, Kristen.
Thanks all, everybody.
Bye, Joseph.
Great session.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you.